I found the envelope on a Tuesday morning. Ray had left early, the way he always did when the light was good. He said the morning sun hit the back porch at an angle that made everything worth painting. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I was looking for the electric bill because I knew it was due, and I knew, as I had known for the past 2 years and 4 months, that I would be the one paying it. The envelope had slipped behind the ceramic bowl on the kitchen counter, the blue one I bought at a craft fair in Asheville the summer before I met him. The return address said Whitmore & Associates, Property Management Group, Cleveland, Ohio. I almost set it aside. It wasn't addressed to me, but the flap had come unsealed. The humidity in North Carolina does that to envelopes, and a single folded page slid out before I could stop it. I didn't mean to read it, but you know how your eyes work before your brain catches up. Annual property tax summary. 4 addresses listed. Total assessed value, $4.2 million. Owner of record, Raymond Allen Shepard. I stood in my kitchen in my bathrobe and I read that line 4 times. Then, I sat down on the floor. I should back up, because none of this makes any sense without the beginning, and the beginning starts 3 years ago in a coffee shop in Chapel Hill when I was 60 years old and newly retired and absolutely certain that the rest of my life would be quiet and small and fine. Fine was what I had settled for. Fine had been enough. I had been a high school principal for 22 years. Before that, a teacher. My whole adult life had been organized around other people's children, other people's schedules, the fluorescent hum of hallways that smelled like floor wax and cafeteria food. I was good at it. I loved it. But by the time I retired, I was tired in a way that went all the way down to something I couldn't name. My daughter, who lives in Seattle with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, called it burnout. My doctor called it adjustment disorder and gave me a pamphlet. My sister called it what it actually was. I had poured everything I had into a career and a marriage that had ended 11 years earlier, and now I was standing in the wreckage of a life I had built for everyone except myself, and I had no idea what came next. I started going to the coffee shop on Rosemary Street because it had good light and fast Wi-Fi, and I was trying to write a memoir that I had promised myself I would start after retirement. I never finished it. But that's where I met Ray. He was at the corner table with a sketchbook and a cup of black coffee that had gone cold. He was 64. Lean in the way that men who spend time outdoors get lean, with paint under his fingernails that he never quite got clean. He looked up when I sat at the table next to him and he said, without any preamble, "You look like someone who just figured out they've been going the wrong direction for a very long time." I told him that was a strange thing to say to a stranger. He said, "I know. But am I wrong?" He wasn't wrong. We talked for 2 hours that first day. He told me he was a watercolor artist, had been painting for 30 years. Sold a few pieces here and there, showed at local galleries sometimes, but mostly he painted because he couldn't stop. He said the money was never reliable, some months good, some months nothing. He was renting a small studio apartment on the east side of town. He drove a truck that was older than some of my former students. I thought he was charming. I thought he was talented. When he showed me the photos on his phone, landscapes mostly, light on water, fog over the Blue Ridge, I thought he was genuinely gifted in a way that the world had simply not gotten around to recognizing yet. I was not naive. I want to say that clearly. I was 60 years old. I had been married, divorced, raised a daughter mostly on my own, managed a staff of 80 people, navigated school board politics, and outlasted 3 different superintendents who all thought they knew better than I did. I was not a woman who got swept away easily, but I had also been alone for 11 years. And Ray Shepard looked at me like I was something worth seeing. At 60. After 11 years of being mostly invisible to the world in the way that women of a certain age become invisible without ever deciding to. So when he asked if I wanted to have dinner, I said yes. And when dinner became a pattern, I let it. And when he kissed me outside that coffee shop on a cold January evening and said he hadn't felt like this in a long time, I believed him. Because I felt it too. I knew about his financial situation from the beginning. He didn't hide it. He talked about it openly, almost with a kind of philosophical detachment, like it was a condition he had accepted rather than a problem he was trying to solve. He had no savings to speak of. A small amount in a checking account that came and went. No retirement fund. He'd had one, years ago, But there had been a difficult period, he mentioned, a divorce, didn't elaborate, said only that it had cost him more than money and he'd cashed it out to cover debts. He paid when he could. When he couldn't, I paid. At first it felt natural. We were two adults building something together. And I had a pension, a modest one but reliable, and the retirement savings I'd put away over 20 years. I could cover dinner. I could cover utilities. It wasn't a hardship. Then I sold my condo. Not because of him. I want to be careful here, because looking back, the lines blur in ways that are uncomfortable. The condo was small and in a neighborhood that had gotten loud. I was thinking about more space. A yard. Ray mentioned, more than once, that he needed better studio space, natural light, room for his larger canvases. When I found the house on Meadowlark Drive, with the big, south-facing sunroom, I told myself I was buying it for me, for my retirement, for the garden I had always wanted. But he moved in 6 months later, and the sunroom became his studio. And his name was never on the deed or the mortgage because he said, and I accepted this, which I have thought about many times since, that it wouldn't be fair to put his name on something he couldn't contribute to financially. My daughter called from Seattle. She said, "Mom, I just want to understand the situation clearly. He lives with you. He doesn't pay rent or mortgage." I said that wasn't quite right, that he contributed when he could. She asked when the last time was that he had contributed. I said I couldn't remember exactly. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Mom, I know you know what I'm going to say." I told her I was a grown woman who had been managing her own life for 6 decades and I appreciated her concern. She said, "Okay, I love you. Call me if you need anything." I did know what she was going to say. I also knew that the way Ray put his hand on the small of my back when we walked somewhere, and the way he always remembered how I took my coffee, and the way he sat with me on the porch in the evenings and talked, really talked, about things that mattered, that none of that had a price I could easily calculate. My friend Carol was less diplomatic. Carol and I had taught together for 15 years. She came for a weekend visit in the 2nd year, and on the 2nd evening, after Ray had gone to bed, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Eleanor, honey, what are you doing?" I told her I was happy. She said, "You're supporting a 65-year-old man with no job and no savings and no plan. That's not a relationship. That's a dependent." I said that was uncharitable. She said, "Is it? When did he last sell a painting?" I didn't answer. "Has he sold anything since you've been together?" The truth was that he had sold 2 small pieces in 2.5 years, together worth about $600. The gallery shows he'd talked about hadn't materialized. The commission he'd mentioned a piece for a hotel lobby in Raleigh had fallen through for reasons he described vaguely and then stopped mentioning. I had started paying for his art supplies without being asked, because I knew he wouldn't ask, and I didn't want him to stop painting. "He's talented," I told Carol. "Sometimes it just takes time." Carol looked at me the way a good friend looks at you when they can see something you refuse to see. Then she let it go. She had known me long enough to know when I had made up my mind. What I didn't tell Carol, what I haven't told anyone really, until now, was that I had started to feel it too. Not doubt, exactly. More like a low, persistent hum underneath everything. A question I kept not asking. My pension covered the mortgage and the basics. My retirement savings were covering the rest: groceries, utilities, raise materials, the truck repair I'd paid for without telling him how much it cost because I knew he'd feel bad, the dental work he'd needed last spring. I had watched my savings account drop by a number I didn't let myself add up clearly, because adding it up clearly would have required me to decide what it meant. I am 62 years old. Or I was, that Tuesday morning on the kitchen floor. My retirement is not a fortune. It is the accumulated result of decades of careful, modest living by a woman who knew she would be on her own and planned accordingly. Every dollar I spent on Ray was a dollar that wasn't there for what came next. Whatever next was, and I had spent a lot of dollars. I got up off the floor. I put the letter back in the envelope. I pressed the flap down as firmly as I could. I set it back on the counter. Then I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about all the things I had told myself over 2.5 years, and I tried to figure out which ones were true. I had told myself he was proud, that he didn't ask for money because his pride wouldn't allow it. I had told myself that the financial imbalance was temporary, that his career was on the verge of turning. I had told myself that what mattered was who he was, not what he had. That money didn't define a person. That I had enough for both of us. And wasn't that a kind of abundance in itself? All of those things felt different now. 4 properties. Total assessed value, $4.2 million. I looked up Whitmore and Associates on my laptop. Property management firm based in Cleveland, specializing in residential and commercial holdings. I looked up the 4 addresses on the letter. 2 residential properties in the Cleveland suburbs, currently rented. 1 small commercial building. 1 vacant lot on a lake outside of Sandusky that the county assessor's website valued at just under $1 million by itself. I sat with that for a long time. Ray came home at 2 in the afternoon, smelling like fresh air and turpentine. He came into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and said it had been a good morning, that he'd gotten something on the canvas that he'd been trying to catch for weeks. He was happy in the specific way he got after a good painting session, loose and expansive, like a different version of himself. Then he saw my face. I had put the envelope in the center of the table. He saw it, and he went very still. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Eleanor?" I said, "Sit down." He sat down. I said, "Tell me what that is." He looked at the envelope, and then he looked at me, and then he looked at his hands on the table. He was quiet for so long that I started to feel something new on top of everything else, something that felt almost like fear. Not of him, of what he was going to say, of what it was going to mean. He said, "I was going to tell you." I said, "When?" He didn't answer. I said, "Ray, I have paid for everything in this house for 2 years. I paid for your truck. I paid for your dental work. I have watched my retirement account go down month after month. I changed how I planned my entire future because I believed, because you let me believe, that you had nothing. And you have $4.2 million in real estate." He said, "I know." I said, "Then explain it to me, because right now I cannot make that make any sense." He was quiet again. Outside, a bird was singing in the yard, that cardinal that had been coming to the feeder all spring, the one Ray always pointed out to me because he said the red against the green was the best composition in nature. I thought about that for a strange second, that cardinal, and then I felt my throat tighten. He said, "Do you remember what I told you about my divorce?" I said I remembered he'd mentioned it. He said, "I didn't tell you everything. I never tell anyone everything about it," because he stopped. Started again. My wife, my ex-wife, her name was Diane. We were married for 19 years. And for most of those years, I was doing well. Better than well, actually. I had inherited property from my father. I had investments. We had a good life. I waited. He said, "When she left, she didn't. It wasn't." He put his hands flat on the table. "She left because I had money. Or rather, she stayed because I had money for a long time. And then when I started to see that, when I started to ask questions about it, she left. And the divorce, she had a very good lawyer and I had a very bad year and I made bad decisions and she took a significant portion of what I had. Not all of it, but enough that it felt like everything." He looked up at me. "I kept the Cleveland properties because they were my father's. I couldn't sell them. I tried once and I couldn't go through with it. And I kept the lake lot because I don't know why, exactly. Because he used to take me fishing there when I was a boy." I said, "That doesn't explain why you let me pay for everything." He said, "No, it doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. "When I met you, I told myself it was temporary, that I would sort things out and start contributing. But then you were so—" He stopped again. "Eleanor, you were the first person in 20 years who seemed to want to be with me because of who I was, not what I had. And I was terrified that if you knew about the properties, about the money, you would start looking at me differently. The way Diane looked at me, the way everyone looked at me when they knew." I said, "That is not a fair thing to do to a person." He said, "I know," I said. "You let me drain my savings. You let me worry. You let me have conversations with my daughter where I defended you, and I believed what I was saying because I didn't know, Ray. I did not know." He said, "I know that. And I am telling you that there is nothing I can say that makes that acceptable. I am not trying to make it acceptable. I am trying to tell you the truth, finally. which I should have done a long time ago, and I understand completely if that's too late. I stood up from the table. I walked to the window and I looked at the yard, the garden I had planted along the back fence, the feeder with the cardinal, the porch where we sat in the evenings, the sunroom where his canvases were lined up against the wall. I thought about all the mornings of the past 2.5 years, the coffee made before I was awake, the way he listened when I talked about my grandchildren, really listened, asked their names and remembered details and asked follow-up questions the next time. The night my sister had her health scare and I couldn't sleep and he sat up with me until 3 in the morning and didn't try to fix it, just stayed. The feeling, and this was the thing I kept coming back to, standing at that window, the feeling of not being alone, of having someone in the same room who was genuinely there. I had spent 11 years being capable and independent and absolutely, quietly alone. And I had spent 2.5 years with Ray, and those years had felt like something different, something I had not expected to feel again at 60. None of that made what he did acceptable. But it was all true at the same time. I turned around. He was watching me with the expression of a man who has put everything down and is waiting to see what happens. I said, "I need you to leave for a while. Not forever. I don't know yet, but I need time to think, and I can't think with you here." He nodded. He didn't argue. He went upstairs and I heard him moving around, and 40 minutes later he came down with a bag and his coat and he stopped in the kitchen doorway. He said, "For what it's worth, and I understand if it's worth nothing right now, I have never in my life felt about anyone the way I feel about you. That part was never a performance. That was the only real thing I knew how to offer." Then he left. I sat in my house alone for the first time in 2.5 years. It was very quiet. The cardinal was still at the feeder. I called my daughter. She didn't say "I told you so." She is a better person than that. She just listened while I talked for a long time, and when I ran out of words, she said, "What do you need, Mom?" I said I didn't know yet. She said, "That's okay. You don't have to know yet." In the weeks that followed, I did a lot of things. I called my financial advisor and we went through my accounts together. Clearly, numbers on paper, no more avoiding the total. It was worse than I had let myself know. Not catastrophic, I was not ruined. I was not facing poverty, but it was real. Enough that I had to revise what I thought the next decade looked like. I talked to a therapist, a woman I'd been to twice before, years ago, who had an office near downtown. I told her the whole story from the beginning. She didn't tell me what to feel or what to do. She asked me a question that I kept thinking about afterward. Separate from the money, what was true in those 2.5 years? And what was false? I thought about that question for a long time. What was false? His need, his struggle, the story I had been given about why I was carrying everything. That was false. He had chosen to let me believe something that wasn't true, and he had sustained that choice every single day, and there is no version of that which is anything other than a lie. What was true, and this is what I had to sit with, because it would have been easier if it weren't true. What was true was harder to dismiss. He had never been unkind to me. He had never made me feel small. He had paid attention to me in the specific, consistent way that matters more at 60 than it did at 30, when attention is cheaper and more abundant. He was, whatever else he was, genuinely present. I thought about Diane. I thought about what he had said about her. I had no way of knowing whether his account of that marriage was accurate. People tell themselves the stories they need to tell. But I had known Ray for 2.5 years, and I knew the way his voice changed when he talked about that period of his life, the way it went flat and careful, like someone pressing a hand against a bruise. Whatever had happened, it had left a mark. That didn't justify what he did to me. I want to be clear about that. There is no version of this where what he did was fine. He let me sacrifice real, material security I had spent a lifetime building because he was afraid. And fear, even understandable fear, is not a reason to deceive someone who trusts you. But I am 62 years old. I have been alive long enough to know that people are not simple. That love, when it's real, does not arrive already sorted into columns of good and bad. That the question, "Was this real?" does not always have a clean answer. 6 weeks after he left, he sent me a letter. A real letter. Handwritten, 4 pages. The kind of letter people used to write before everyone forgot how. He did not ask me to take him back. He did not make excuses. He spent 4 pages telling me what the 2.5 years had meant to him. Specifically, in detail, small moments I had forgotten and large ones I hadn't. And at the end, he said that he had contacted his property manager and begun the process of liquidating 2 of the rental properties. That the money from the sale, less taxes, was going to be transferred into an account in my name as repayment for what I had spent and what I had lost, and that he asked nothing in return and expected nothing, and that this was not a gesture to get me back, but a thing he should have done long ago. I read that letter 3 times. Then I called Carol. She listened to the whole thing. At the end, she said, "Well, that is genuinely the most complicated love story I've heard in 63 years of life." I said, "I don't know what to do." She said, "What do you want to do?" I sat with that. Here is the thing about being 62. You stop having the luxury of unlimited time to figure things out. The questions get more immediate, not in a morbid way, just in a true way. You start to understand that the time you have is finite in a way that 30-year-olds know in theory and 60-year-olds know in the body. I had been alone for 11 years before Ray. Fine, small, quiet. And then 2.5 years of something that was complicated and imperfect and built on a foundation that I had not been told the truth about, but also something that had felt, most days, like being alive in a way I had missed. I called him. He answered on the second ring. I said, "I need you to understand something first. What you did was not acceptable. The way you let me spend my savings, the way you let me worry, the way you gave me a false picture of your life for 2.5 years, that is not something I can just set aside." He said, "I know." I said, "And if we go forward, that cannot be who we are. I need the truth from you, all of it, even the parts you think might make me see you differently." He said, "I understand." I said, "I mean it. The version of trust building that involves hiding things because you're scared is done. That is done." He said, "It's done." There was a pause. I said, "How's the painting going?" He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then he said, "I finished the one I was working on. The morning you found the letter, actually. I think it might be the best thing I've ever made." I said, "I'd like to see it." He said, "I'd like that too." We did not fall back into each other easily. That would be a lie, and I've had enough of lies, including the ones we tell ourselves to make stories neater than they are. There were months of hard conversations, of me saying things I needed to say, and him listening without deflecting, of both of us figuring out what this was and what we wanted it to be. He moved back in the spring, not because I had forgiven everything, but because forgiveness is not a single moment. It is a long, gradual thing, and you can begin it while still having work left to do. My daughter came to visit in the summer. She sat on the porch with Ray for an hour while I was on the phone with my grandchildren, and when I came out they were talking about something that had made them both laugh. Later, when Ray had gone inside, she sat next to me and said, "He knows what he did." I said, "He does." She said, "And you're okay?" I looked at the garden along the back fence, the cardinal at the feeder that had come back for a second summer, the sunroom through the glass doors where a new canvas leaned half-finished against the wall. I said, "I think I'm going to be." She leaned her head on my shoulder for a moment, the way she used to when she was small, and I thought about all the things you can't know in advance about people, about yourself, about what the second half of your life will turn out to hold. I had spent 11 years building a life that was fine. I am still figuring out what it means to build one that is more than that. But for the first time in a long time, I think that's worth figuring out.